At the time of this recording, Sonic X Shadow Generations is just over a week out from release, and that's a surreal thing to think about. Sonic Generations was my introduction to Sonic, the first game in the series I ever finished. I was 7 years old when it released and only a little older when I got around to playing the game, and it introduced me to a world and set of characters and a gameplay formula that, over the course of the next almost decade and a half, I would slowly fall in love with. Or maybe more accurately, become absolutely obsessed with. I still distinctly remember playing Generations for the first time, being so bad at it that I struggled to obtain the S ranks on each level, a task about as difficult as tying your shoes. Though I struggled with that as a kid too. Having to retry the stages over and over and unconsciously forming an appreciation for the inherent replayability of these games. Over time, I'd travel back through the series' history. I downloaded the Retro Engine remasters of Sonic 1, 2, and CD on my first phone in 6th grade, and I remember staying up all night the night before Sonic Mania released just trying to finish Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and saves coming my way through the special stages. I'd then proceed to play Mania over 100 times over the course of the next few years before, on a whim, deciding to download Dolphin Emulator for my laptop in early high school, alongside a ROM of Sonic Adventure. That was the point of no return. I already liked Sonic up to that point, but by late 2019, I was addicted to these games, all because of Sonic Adventure. I blasted through all of the 3D Sonic games I had missed out on in a few short months, and then relentlessly pestered my friends to play Sonic Mania, Sonic Adventure, Sonic Unleashed, and so on as I eagerly awaited news on the next big Sonic project. And now, waiting for a re-release of the game that sparked my passion for this franchise, having played every single mainline game in the interstice between these two generations releases, I'm more eager than ever to reflect on my relationship with the series. And hey, instead of just thinking to myself or yapping to my friends about these games for the millionth time, why not channel that energy into a YouTube channel? So here I sit, ready to write yet another YouTube retrospective on the Sonic series. And I think I know a good place to start. Quick note before we begin, I'll be using the aforementioned Retro Engine remake of Sonic 1 featured in Sonic Origins for the purposes of this review. It was the most convenient way of gathering the footage for this video on top of being my preferred version of the game, with widescreen, a consistent frame rate, and some smoothed over glitches, among other enhancements. After all, I see no point critiquing an outdated version of the game when those criticisms are rendered irrelevant by a modern iteration. With that out of the way, Sonic the Hedgehog's development history has been talked about extensively, so I'll try to keep this brief. Sega was struggling to find their footing in the console space in the late 80s with Nintendo's stranglehold over the industry, and they needed a game to bring attention to their new 16-bit system, the Genesis. Yuji Naka, a programmer at Sega in the early 90s, alongside designer Naoto Oshima, conceived an action platformer where you take the reins of a fast-paced character traversing flowing landscapes, a concept Naka became interested in after playing Ghouls and Ghosts. Oshima drafted up a few character designs that could potentially fit the starring role before he landed on an anthropomorphic blue hedgehog named Sonic. The game was designed with the intent to be intuitive to play, with Naka going so far as to decide that it should require the use of one face button on the controller. By June of 1991 in North America, and the following month in other territories, Sonic the Hedgehog was completed and released to the public to universal acclaim and massive sales success. That's the gist of it. Sonic the Hedgehog's premise is fairly simple. You follow Sonic, a speedy blue hedgehog, as he traverses South Island, running through 6 zones divided into 3 acts each, in a journey to free animals trapped inside robotic badniks and defeat the mad scientist Dr. Eggman, whom you battle at the end of each zone. Collecting 50 rings and carrying them to the gold plate in either of the first 2 acts of a zone will unlock an entrance to a special stage, which gives Sonic the chance to obtain one of the 6 Chaos Emeralds required for unlocking the game's good ending. It's easy to look at Sonic at a conceptual level as this bizarre amalgam of disparate ideas, but what's surprising to me is how well all of it fits together in the actual game. Dr. Eggman, for example, was at first another one of Oshima's potential designs for the role of the protagonist. It was later decided that he would fill the role of antagonist instead, and his design was altered to better suit this change. The pairing of these two characters is at face value strange, but makes perfect sense when given a little thought. Sonic is an animal, a hedgehog, who fights a human and his man-made machines. There's a nature versus technology motif present that came to be through clever use of two initially disconnected designs, and is further cemented through the stages in the game. A hedgehog initially seems like a random animal to choose for the starring role of the game, like they could have just used a more popular animal like a dog or a cat, but a hedgehog was selected specifically because hedgehogs can curl up into a ball. Yuji Naka thought that the utilization of this ability as both a means of combat and a way of picking up speed when rolling down slopes would perfectly suit his vision for a speedy platform game. All of these ideas that initially seem arbitrary actually form a very cohesive package that not only makes Sonic appealing, but also lends it an intuitive quality. It's easy to point to Sonic and his contemporaries and claim that they were comprised of a series of unrelated elements just sort of cobbled together, but I find that a bit dismissive. There was a clear vision with Sonic 1 that formed during development and came together in the finished product. Those bizarre elements are exactly what allow Sonic to find a home in the hearts of so many people, myself included. The gameplay of Sonic is unlike anything else. Things are kept remarkably approachable with Naka's decision to use a one-button control scheme. One would be led to believe that this would make the gameplay too simple, but that couldn't be further from the truth. While Sonic can only run, roll, and jump, the game has an immensely high skill ceiling owed to its momentum physics. These can cause the game to have a small learning curve for people accustomed to traditional platformers. Introduce Sonic to a complete novice and you'll watch them fumble around on slopes, inch their way up little hills and bumps, or be sent flying in the wrong direction by a spring and frantically scramble to bring Sonic to a stop and reset his momentum. It can be initially irritating to feel as though you don't have complete control over the character in the same way that you would when you pick up a Mario game, but there's a depth here that supersedes the initial frustration that you may feel in your first brush with the game. For example, when Sonic builds up enough speed, he can jump off of slopes and, depending on their angle, be sent flying at different heights. Jump at top speed when you're running on an upward slope, and you'll jump higher than you would on flat ground. Meanwhile, jump on a downward slope and Sonic will do a shorter jump, but one that will give him an extra burst of speed once he hits the ground. This unique behavior can even be manipulated when running through loops by leaping off the top and smashing Sonic into the curvature of it to build additional speed. All of this depth serves to preserve what I consider to be the core conceit of Sonic gameplay and level design, which is the player's flow state. An ideal run through a Sonic stage may not always be as blisteringly fast as the game's marketing would attempt to convince you it is. It's usually more like a brisk jaunt, but playing well enough will allow you to keep your flow alive throughout an entire level, chaining together jumps and rolls so that you're never prevented from making progress. Good Sonic levels are designed around this balancing act of allowing constant progress while still throwing roadblocks in the player's path that they have to circumvent, and the fun comes from learning to circumvent them quickly. There's a euphoric sensation that comes from keeping your flow state alive throughout an entire stage, this rhythmic quality that the best stages have that cause these games to be so addictive for me. I wouldn't blame a new player for expecting that Sonic's advertised speed would be ever present, handed right to them when they start playing, but through a little effort you'll realize that earning your speed is infinitely more satisfying than the alternative. The first level of Sonic the Hedgehog, Green Hill Zone, puts these principles into practice in an immediately compelling and understandable manner. This level has been talked about to death, but that's for good reason. It does almost everything right when it comes to introducing Sonic's initially foreign gameplay to new players. You're plopped straight from the title screen into a level filled with branching paths and slopes to build momentum on and launch yourself around. Loops and shuttle tubes provide quick bursts of speed and are paced out incrementally throughout the level to reward players' efforts. The stage doesn't skimp out on traditional platforming either. I've always appreciated how the opening moments of Green Hill have Sonic steadily climbing upward while dodging enemies, jumping in a slower paced sequence before the level opens up into a more speed-focused segment about 30 seconds in, where Sonic gets to run down some slopes and through a loop for the first time. Ignore the loop, though, decide to keep platforming instead and climb up above it, and you'll be placed on an upper path with more rings on it, the trade-off being that this route requires a little extra effort to reach. The reward beyond the additional rings is a straightaway with a tunnel at the end that sends you barreling through it, establishing a pattern of speed being granted to the player after they complete some platforming. The lower route actually showcases another unique appeal of Sonic, which is its ability to build spectacle into its levels. After going through the loop, which is already exciting if you've somehow never seen or played Sonic before, Sonic is sent through 2 shuttle tubes and then launched into the air, where you collect a bunch of rings and can even smash through some badniks. This brief section is exciting, but it's also commendable how it utilizes the baked-in physics system to give the player a thrill rather than automating things. I mean, the segment is somewhat automated. The player loses control momentarily when traveling through the shuttle tubes, but the segment is constructed using the rolling mechanics built into the game's framework instead of being specifically programmed for this segment. This moment cleverly plants ideas about what else Sonic Speed is capable of as early as the first act of the first zone. Regarding that subject, there's an interesting moment in KingK's retrospective on this game, which is a great video by the way, I recommend checking it out if you somehow haven't already, where he talks about how, in Act 2 of Green Hill Zone, there's a loop with an item monitor on top of it that is seemingly unreachable. However, if you move back to the beginning of the stage, taking the lowest route, you'll find a pair of speed shoes, which will speed Sonic up just enough so that he can then run and jump off a wall next to the loop and nab the item monitor. What's funny about this segment of the video is that KingK doesn't mention, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that the lower route you take to reach the speed shoes actually leads to a red spring that can also take you to the top of the same loop. But I'm actually happy he brings up this alternative approach to reaching the item monitor because it highlights how Sonic lends players the tools to express themselves by tackling obstacles through unintended means. Using KingK's approach may actually be a more efficient way of reaching the item monitor, or maybe he just finds it more gratifying to take this approach. Regardless, it's a testament to the strength of Sonic's versatile gameplay that this situation was even possible. Act 2 is also home to another noteworthy chunk of level design in which an upward slope is placed right before a challenging platforming sequence with moving platforms, spikes, and a bottomless pit. This is a great example of how Sonic levels telegraph their obstacles through minor speed traps. The slope in this instance launching Sonic upward temporarily stalls his forward momentum, giving the player enough time to notice the spikes to the right of the screen and slow themselves down instead of charging ahead. Any damage taken beyond this point is entirely in the hands of the player, because they knew the spikes were there and still decided to plop themselves down on them. At their best, Sonic stages avoid the pitfall of having gameplay so fast that it's hard to react to incoming hazards through little tricks like this. And it's cool that the designers realized that Sonic's speed could cause frustration and planned around it even in the first game. Up until now, I've only been talking about the level design strength of Green Hill Zone, but just as important to me in a Sonic level are the aesthetic qualities it possesses. Green Hill is such a vibrant, exciting location to start the game in. It's not as though the idea of a game starting in a laid-back, grassy area was invented with Sonic 1, but up until this point we had never seen this archetype so fully realized in a video game. The image is dense with detail, from the rotating flowers to the flowing waterfalls in the background to the checkerboard pattern on the dirt. It's a picturesque location that's teeming with life, perfect for getting the player amped up for the start of the adventure through its vibrant colors, but simultaneously a very calm setting, ideal for the start of the game. This juxtaposition is felt in Green Hill's music too, which unfortunately has been massively overplayed to the point that it's sort of taken for granted. It simultaneously has this whimsical, upbeat energy, even kicking off with a little wind-up of escalating notes, while still sounding tranquil and pleasant at the same time. As great as some future arrangements of this track have been, there's never been a version of it that completely nails the balance the original song contains. What's truly striking, not just about Green Hill Zone, but all the zones in Sonic 1, is how the settings of the stages are perfectly embodied through the stage design. Green Hill is this wide open landscape with cliffs and flowing plains, and so the stage is designed with this in mind. Paths are easy to swap between and flow naturally into one another at a constant rate, emulating the sense of freedom the aesthetics of the stage are meant to invoke. Even the level geometry mirrors the stage's setting, as the ground is almost never entirely flat, littered with little curves and bumps, if not steep slopes and hanging cliffs. Contrast this with a level like Marble Zone, which has a man-made underbelly with sharp, hard geometric edges and little in the way of slopes, or Springyard Zone, which features deliberate, smooth curves as opposed to the naturalistic terrain of Green Hill. The attention to detail from the artists and stage designers here helped to lend the game some variation in its main stages, something that sets Sonic apart from a Mario game, which, especially at the time, would often reuse assets, music, and terrain throughout the entire game. This isn't even meant to be a knock against Mario. I adore Mario. Instead, it's meant to emphasize how impressive it is that Sonic Team went the extra mile to make each area feel distinct, a trend that would thankfully continue throughout most of the series. Sonic's locations are so evocative and memorable, and they really make these games for me. At the ends of Acts 1 and 2 of each zone, the gold plate is surrounded by invisible emblems that you can unveil by jumping through them, and they each have a corresponding point total that gets added to your score when you do. This is a peculiarity with Sonic 1. I mean, this idea never came back in any future releases, though the concept of scoring bonuses at the end of the stage would live on through the gold plate juggling of Sonic 3 and Mania, and the breakable numbers in Sonic Colors. The more I've thought on it though, I think I like Sonic 1's approach the best because of how simple it is. Those other two examples require you to kind of put the game on hold for a moment, and I always get tired of them after a while. Like, I'll hit the gold plate twice in Angel Island and then remember I'm gonna die someday, and I cut that shit out for the rest of the playthrough. With Sonic 1, these emblems don't interrupt your progress. You wouldn't be finishing the stage any faster if you didn't activate them, so it's pretty fun just jumping for them at the end of each level, and I like the little sound they make too. Sound design in all these games is phenomenal, nothing new to say about it, just thought I'd mention it because I love the sound the game makes when Sonic fucking obliterates the badniks. I don't have much to say about Act 3, it's also good. A lot of invincibility monitors, like you can chain them from the start of the stage all the way until the boss. In fact, Sonic 1 feels like it has far and away the most invincibility monitors of any Sonic game, especially proportionate to game length. There's like at least one in every act. Other than that, Act 3 is pretty standard fare. You fight a boss. That's Green Hill Zone. Now, up until this point, I haven't said anything too different from the default Sonic 1 YouTube reviewer opinion. Green Hill fun, momentum good, etc, etc. And after Green Hill, it's widely agreed upon that Sonic 1 completely derails and fails to capitalize upon the potential that its first stage so effectively teases. Right after Green Hill is Marble Zone, a linear pace breaker of a stage that knocks the game so far off balance it's unable to recover for the rest of its runtime. But see, this is where I break from this collective conditioning we've all endured and tell the three people watching this the truth, which is that Sonic the Hedgehog is good all the way through. This video is a defense of Sonic 1 from all the ne'er-do-wells out there. You guys are wrong, and I'm gonna prove it. One of the most common complaints levied against Sonic 1, which rears its head for the first time in Marble Zone and later reappears in the infamous Labyrinth Zone, is linearity. Compared to Green Hill, Marble Zone is almost oppressively restrictive in its progression. There's quite a few stretches here where there's only a single way forward, and I've seen this used as a knock against the level. Personally though, I've never agreed with the arbitrary logic that a linear level is a bad one when it comes to Sonic stages. Sure, multiple pathways can enhance a level, but they're one of many factors that contribute to a stage's quality. Some of the others being pacing, unique stage gimmicks, and atmosphere. Marble Zone's pacing is actually pretty solid. Sure, there are a few moments where you're forced to come to a stop and wait for a chandelier to fall or a block to cross some lava, but these are sparse and many of them can actually be skipped. For example, there's a block pushing segment in Act 1 where you can ride a moving block over some lava, but there's also two platforms floating above the lava that are spaced just close enough together that you can just jump across them to skip the waiting. Sonic is all about finding ways to optimize your runs through a stage. Naka based the entire game around this idea, so I don't necessarily have a problem with waiting in a Sonic game as long as that waiting can be bypassed by taking an optimal route or through skillful play. And this isn't like some kind of speedrun skip either, it's completely manageable for any player of average skill. They just need to get the idea in their heads to do it and be willing to take a risk to pull it off. There are plenty of moments throughout Marble Zone that can also be bypassed with some ingenuity. An invincibility monitor placed right next to some lava allows you to run right over it. A hidden passage tucked away behind a chandelier cuts off a huge chunk of the level. The stage designers were clearly conscious of the waiting baked into Marble's design, and so they built the stage around finding ways to circumvent that waiting. This concept hasn't been explored nearly as much in subsequent entries, and I don't blame people for being annoyed with Marble Zone, but I commend the effort to experiment with stage design, and it paid off pretty well here. There's something cool about the dichotomy between the upper areas of Marble Zone and its underbelly too. Being out in the open, the surface of Marble embodies a very similar style design to Green Hill, with smooth slopes and an absence of ceilings to box you in. Clever exploitation of little divots in the ground will give you an upward boost when jumping, enough height to skip over the fireballs that periodically leap out of the lava pools. Dive underground though, and things become more rigid, more claustrophobic. Marble's ruins are populated with a bevy of different stage gimmicks: spike chandeliers, falling blocks, breakable blocks, moving pillars, lava rivers, and a lot more. The variety of stage gimmicks in all the zones in Sonic 1 remains one of the most impressive elements of the game and of all of classic Sonic, not only for how they keep the zones consistently interesting, but also for how sparingly each of these gimmicks is used. It's not just the gimmicks themselves that keep Marble Zone interesting though. It's the ways they're integrated into the design that really bolster the zone's appeal. You'll go from jumping across platforms that sink into lava, to running from a wall of fire, to smashing through a collection of breakable blocks that award you a 1-up if you break them all in succession. One of the most unique bits comes in a platforming section at the end of Act 3, where you ride a block across some lava in the bottom portion of a giant room, before scaling a staircase and doing some tight jumps on small platforms between spikes and blocks that are chained to the ceiling. It's real fun to weave between the spikes, taking big leaps to avoid having to land on the chained blocks, and doing the whole section without interruption. Falling in this section drops Sonic back down to the lower area of the room instead of taking a life, where he's forced to make his way back up the steps to try again. There's nothing really like this in the entire rest of the game, nor is there anything like any of the other examples I listed before, and that's impressive. The devs never copy and paste bits of level design or rely on the same few ideas repeatedly to pad out the game. Instead, there's this playful element to Sonic 1 where every room, every chunk of design has some new idea in it to toy around with for a bit, and then you're on to the next one. I like this for two reasons. One, it obviously keeps things from getting dull, but two, it sort of brings me closer to the developers, as corny as that sounds. When there's this much experimentation going on, this many concentrated doses of creativity being thrown at you back to back, it gets easier to envision the team just getting together and pitching ideas or showing off little bits of gameplay they came up with to each other. You can really tell the people making this had a lot of fun with it just from how much experimentation is going on, and that's really fitting for a game that encourages the player to experiment with what Sonic is capable of too. At this point, I've been pretty thorough with my analysis of each of the zones, but we're going to speed things up a bit since I have less to say about the rest of the zones. I already got my analysis of the gameplay and level design philosophy out of the way with Green Hill, and I hit you with the cold water regarding my opinion on the game with Marble Zone, so from here on, it should be pretty smooth sailing. I figure I should tackle Labyrinth now, since although it's not the zone that comes immediately after Marble Zone, it's even more divisive. I wouldn't say I like Labyrinth Zone, it's hard to say you like Labyrinth Zone, but I don't dislike it either. In fact, I respect what it's trying to do. With much of Sonic 1, speed is encouraged, but not really enforced. Labyrinth changes that. Sonic will drown if he spends too long underwater, and with how much of the level takes place underwater, you're incentivized to speed through most of it so that you can either reach air bubbles or resurface above the water. This is a clever way of integrating Sonic's speed into the level design, encouraging flow through a pressure state induced by the threat of drowning. That said, this approach isn't without its problems. First, I could never understand why the air bubble dispensers are set on a timer instead of just refilling your air whenever you approach them. It harms the flow of the level when you're forced to wait around for an air bubble to spawn, and in the worst case, it could even end up killing you if you reach an air dispenser with only a few seconds remaining and the bubble doesn't pop out in time. Second, Sonic is much slower underwater, making precision platforming and quick movement a lot less fun and immediate. It can be a decent challenge being made to contend with the sluggish controls to navigate the level's hazards, but ideally that challenge would be optional and skilled players wouldn't have to deal with awkward physics for too long. All that said, I can't bring myself to call this zone a failure. It's got a lot going for it, from its striking aesthetic to its decidedly different approach to level design. I really like how shortcuts are implemented here. Instead of just being a simple upper and lower situation, shortcuts require some light puzzle solving to access. One memorable shortcut requires that you dive down into the water toward the beginning of Act 1, press a button, and then perform a precise jump off of a rising platform to make your way back up to the surface of the water to reach a platform that spawns in. Obtuse alternate paths like this are really fitting for a level titled Labyrinth Zone, and while this one may be obscure, it's equally rewarding in that it skips the majority of Labyrinth's first act. Even ignoring the shortcuts, Labyrinth still has that impressive variety that I spoke about earlier with Marble Zone. There's water slides, a massive room filled with ring monitors, rising tides, underwater currents, conveyor belts. So much is packed into just this 3-act level that I'm never fully annoyed because when one segment starts to get on my nerves, a new idea is thrown into the mix that keeps the novelty alive. Hell, I even like the boss of Labyrinth Zone. I've seen a lot of dissent toward this boss in particular, but it might just be my favorite in the game for how it escalates the central concept of the level. All of Labyrinth Zone is built around quickly navigating underwater obstacle gauntlets to avoid drowning, and the boss tests your ability to do this with the strictest platforming sequence yet. Instead of a traditional boss, Eggman shows up momentarily at the end of the act, but then he flies off and you have to chase him through a series of spears and fireballs while water rises beneath you. This set piece is claustrophobic, but I like that about it. It's immensely satisfying to make it through this segment unscathed, and even more satisfying to do that without letting the water catch up to you. I even mentioned before how skilled players should have the opportunity to avoid water physics, and this segment lets them do just that. It's a bit weird that Eggman presents himself at the beginning of the fight as though you're supposed to get hits in on him, even though you don't have to do that at all to clear this section, but aside from that, I like this section as a test of skill for everything you've learned over the course of the zone. Two of the more well-liked zones in the game are Spring Yard Zone and Starlight Zone, and both of these stages do really cool things worth talking about. Spring Yard is the level that makes the best use of Sonic's momentum in conjunction with verticality. It's a major reason why I'd consider Sonic 1 to be a good starting point for newcomers to the series, even if it isn't the most fun game to start with, just because this zone alone does a great job emphasizing the importance of Sonic's momentum physics. You quickly learn that rolling is the most efficient way to scale the many half-pipes littering the stage and access upper routes and even stashes of invincibility monitors and speed shoes. Rolling around protects Sonic from a type of badnik that emulates Sonic's trademark rolling ability, since it will bounce off of you if you're rolling when it makes contact. All of this conditions the player to consider rolling as an integral component of their toolkit, but it's also just a lot of fun watching Sonic shoot down the side of a half-pipe and launch up the other side. There's also forced waiting in this level just like in Marble, but unlike with Marble, none of these sections are required. Every one of them can be skipped over by taking the top path or, in the case of Act 1, activating a pair of speed shoes right at the start of the level and launching yourself over the zone's ceiling. I imagine this shortcut was intentional, but even if it wasn't, it's still so much fun to pull off every single time. It's a really great showcase of how exhilarating classic Sonic gameplay can be when a little bit of ingenuity is applied. And even in this level, the developers were still cooking up new ways to implement shortcuts into the level design. At the beginning of Act 1, there's a floating platform that you just can't reach. Wait. What? What act is that supposed to be? I put a colon in instead of a number. At the beginning of Act colon, I don't know what that is. That's not in the game. I'm just gonna say Act 3. It could be wrong. At the beginning of Act 3, there's a floating platform that you just can't quite reach by jumping. Just to your left, though, there's a pit with some red springs that you can use to launch yourself up and reach that platform, tying the level's verticality into its shortcut design. There's also a segment where you race a moving block to a stash of ring monitors, one of only 2 times in the game as far as I'm aware that you have to be quick enough to be able to reach a certain pathway. I really appreciate how the developers were constantly considering the type of level that they were making and baking shortcuts into the stages in the most fitting ways possible. Spring Yard Zone is also the poster child for Sonic 1's weird, downbeat energy compared to any other game in the series. It feels a lot more low-key, in a good way. It's more atmospheric, and the levels embody the surrealism of Sonic more than most of the other classic Sonic games, while still remaining more grounded than the locations in, say, Sonic CD. Like, it's not really clear what Spring Yard is. It's a scrap pile on the outskirts of a city that may or may not be abandoned, with floating neon lettering everywhere. It feels sort of like it could exist in real life, but then the excessive slopes and springs and the cope signs add this uncanny element that makes it one of the most unique locations I've seen in a platformer game. Coupled with the zone's music track, which sounds both apprehensive and encouraging, and that's also just funky as hell, and you get an atmosphere unlike anything else in the Sonic series. It makes this an interesting game to come back to. Sonic 2 established a lively, energetic atmosphere that the series would run with in most of its subsequent entries, so there's a novelty in watching the team figure out what they wanted the vibe of the series to be. Starlight Zone, meanwhile, is interesting because it's the only zone in the game that feels like a true follow-up to Green Hill. It's got just as many slopes and loops despite managing to be decently challenging, being the 5th of 6 zones. I wouldn't say Starlight is as hard as Labyrinth Zone, though it is more punishing with an instant death pit at the bottom of the stage. Upper routes are a breeze, but if you manage to fall down to the lower areas, the platforming becomes much more strict and the level slows down, which is a pretty smart way of designing a speed-focused platformer, and a style of design Sonic Team would rely on heavily in future titles. This level's enemies are also more demanding than Labyrinth Zone's, since 2 of them are virtually invulnerable, forcing you to weave around them instead, and one of those 2 even explodes and spits projectiles at you. It's really overwhelming when they put a handful of these bomb badniks in a cramped section right at the end of an act when you're trying not to lose the 50 rings you have so you can reach a special stage. Oh yeah, special stages are in the game too. What I like about them here is that they're the only special stages in the series that don't introduce a different control scheme for Sonic. When you enter one, you're still on a 2D plane and can jump around, the only difference being that you're locked into your ball form for the duration of the stage. The only thing that changes is your goal, which becomes navigating a rotating maze to reach a Chaos Emerald, and collecting rings along the way to get continues. The special stages in Sonic 1 sort of feel like the bonus stages you'd get in an arcade game, wherein you're given a chance to obtain some extra rewards during a brief reprieve from the standard gameplay. In later games in the series, special stages would mostly be about obtaining Chaos Emeralds so that you can unlock Super Sonic. With Super Sonic not existing in this game, it feels more like the primary function of the special stages is to allow players a chance to rack up continues, which lends them that arcade-like feel. Currently, most Sonic 1 ports have a save system, either allowing you to restart from the beginning of an act when you game over instead of from the beginning of the game, or they ditch the live system altogether. While I can appreciate this as a way to make the game more inviting, it's one in many ways in which I feel the design of the game is slightly compromised through tweaks and additions made in re-releases. Another one of those problematic additions is the spin dash. I like having the spin dash in Sonic 1. I mean, it's always nice to have it there as an option, but it does take some of the onus off the player to engage with Sonic's momentum physics, since a loss in momentum doesn't have as much of an impact when you can instantly gain a burst of speed using the spin dash. I even see people complaining about this one chunk of Marble Zone where a red spring follows up 2 Caterkillers. In the re-releases, the most optimal way to take out Caterkillers is by spin dashing through them, since jumping would risk landing on their spikes instead of their heads. However, spin dashing here causes you to collide with the spring, which shoots you back into the lava. The problem is that if you just roll instead of spin dashing, you'll have more than enough time to react to the spring and jump over it. Even still, the definitive way to play Sonic 1 is probably through these re-releases, specifically the Retro Engine remake on mobile devices and included in Sonic Origins. I have my pedantic little issues with the additions made to this remake, but it's undoubtedly the most accessible version of the game. I even enjoy some of the cool bonus features, like adding Tails and Knuckles as playable characters. These guys can improve levels like Marble Zone, where their unique abilities can circumvent some of the forced waiting. Just to circle back to the special stages again, since I got a little sidetracked, they can be annoying to navigate. I never quite feel like I have complete control of Sonic in them, constantly fighting bumpers and switches that change the direction the maze rotates in. The silver lining is that the Chaos Emeralds don't unlock anything other than flowers on the ending screen, so I never feel as though I have to play them, in the same way that I do with the special stages in Sonic 3 or Sonic Mania. They're just there as a once-in-a-while kind of thing. With everything else out of the way, the only zone remaining is Scrap Brain Zone, which is a fitting climax to the game. It's by far the toughest zone, with some devious hazards packed together in tight corridors. It still isn't impossible to clear most of Scrap Brain Zone interrupted, though waiting is much more heavily encouraged, especially for a new player who isn't familiar with the level design. The zone can be a bit abrasive with how much it throws at you, and there's an unfortunate byproduct to spamming hazards that don't kill the player, that being that it's very easy to damage boost through them and recollect your rings to avoid waiting around. The worst part of this is that, unlike the other 5 zones, Scrap Brain Zone is the only zone in the game where collecting 50 rings and reaching the end of the level won't spawn in a special stage entrance. This means that there isn't much incentive to keep your rings here other than the illusory promise of an extra life. Yeah, good luck with that. Because of this, Scrap Brain Zone is a flawed stage, but still a cool one. It's the only level in the game where all 3 acts have their own backgrounds, a neat detail to visually convey Sonic delving deeper into the belly of the beast with each act. While Act 3 is unfortunately a Labyrinth Zone revisit, I can at least acknowledge that taking the player through a version of Labyrinth sapped of its color does a good job wordlessly representing the threat Eggman poses to South Island. This probably would have hit a lot harder had Labyrinth Zone been the second zone in the game, as the level select suggests this was the intended order originally, but it's for the best that they saved it for later so that people actually ended up finishing the game. Scrap Brain also does a good job keeping the number of pathways consistently above 1 in all 3 acts. You're never railroaded onto a single route, which allows the player to pick their poison when it comes to the obstacles they'll face. As much as Scrap Brain Zone is a suitable location for the finale of the game, the same can't be said about the final boss, which is anticlimactic. Eggman has pistons. You hit them 8 times just like every other boss fight, only this time you don't have rings, which only really makes the fight arbitrarily more difficult. It would have been nice to allow the player some rings on their first go at the fight if they managed to keep some into the end of the last act. It even feels like they were setting up for this, because Scrap Brain Zone Act 3 is the only level in the game to end abruptly instead of closing out with a gold plate or an animal capsule. But when you enter the final zone, you lose all your rings for some inexplicable reason. Even worse is that after you beat the boss, the game is just done. No second phase, no cool extra form, you just fight pistons, and it's underwhelming that the finale is so lackluster in the first game when the series would later come to be known for its exciting final sequences. The ending cinematic too is kinda quaint, just a brief cutscene of Sonic running back through Green Hill with some flowers spawning if you manage to gather all the Chaos Emeralds. Really highlights how the Sonic series progression in scope is a crescendo, with the first installment in particular being a bit lax compared to everything that came after. Not that that's a problem. I like the get in, get out feel of Sonic 1, and the comparatively lower stakes make it a pretty cozy game to come back to every now and then. And that about wraps up Sonic the Hedgehog. Its quality is a bit uneven, but I'd still say that it's an underrated entry in the series. The game deviates from retroactively established convention and its own marketing material to deliver something unexpected but still engaging. It maintains a core philosophy of player expression and achieving an addictive flow state while simultaneously containing such impressive variety that it avoids falling into homogeneity. There's an unparalleled sense of whimsy poured into the game by the devs that bleeds through the entire experience. Like, I didn't even mention them, but there's so many weird oddities in the stage design. Like a swinging platform in Starlight Zone with spikes on its underside that only appears once and can be completely ignored. Or a set of hidden spikes placed completely out of the way in a small room in Marble Zone that can also be ignored and don't pose a threat. Both of these examples could have been omitted from the game without remotely impacting the level design, but I imagine some dev just put them in there because they wanted to, because they thought it would be funny to put some spikes completely out of the way, or they spent time designing a dual-purpose platform end hazard and just liked it so much that they wanted it to be in the game somewhere. Stuff like this is endearing and gives Sonic 1 a distinct personality, one defined by its ability to surprise me. Sonic 1 is many things, but it's never predictable, instead reveling in the unexpected. I play games to be surprised, to feel things I didn't expect to feel, and to come out the other end with a memorable experience, and this game fulfills that desire. It's far from perfect, but as the opener to one of my favorite series ever, Sonic 1 leaves a killer first impression.